Good evening, parents, carers and community members. Thank you for joining us this evening for our webinar on when parents and carers worry too much. And hopefully you're going to get some fantastic support and some guidance and top tips from a familiar face that you might recognise, who I think is now part of the extended Forest family. But I'll introduce our speaker in due course. I just wanted to highlight our last webinar before the May half term is on a topic that's very relevant in terms of young people and families nowadays, and it's going to focus on digital images and the law. And we've seen a lot on social media and all different forms of media regarding this area and this ever-changing area. So please do join us if you can on Thursday, the 21st of May, where we do have a specialist that's going to really take us into that very complex world of digital images and the law, but also to inform us as community members, as specifically parents and carers. So without further ado, I hope you have heard of our speaker this evening and you've seen our previous webinars led by Anita. She will be hopefully back to deliver some more, and we are so happy to have her this evening. So as a reminder, Anita is an award-winning parenting carer speaker. She's a writer and she's a coach, and she supports working parents and carers to balance successful careers with being a parent and carer. And that's always me having to take notes when I listen to Anita as well. She speaks at a variety of events, working parents and carers across the UK, internationally as well, and delivers webinars such as this evening for working parents and carers at top global companies. She has a range of books and they've been translated into 13 different languages. That shows the impact she's had across the world. Her first book, The Work Parent Switch, known as the Working Parent Survival Guide, that's in the US, outlines how working parents and carers can use the bits of time left over when work is done to parent and care smarter, not harder, and be the parent their child needs. And I know we're all trying to navigate that as parents and carers, as members of the Forest community. She's got a most recent book that came out in September 2024, How to Get Your Teenager Out of Their Bedroom, and that came out to 5-star reviews. She was recently named in the Times as one of the top 5 parenting coaches in the UK. She's regularly featured in the media across BBC, CNBC and The Telegraph, and she's currently appearing as an expert in Series 2 at Home with Catherine Ryan. She's an accredited P parenting facilitator, if you've heard of that wonderful programme, and she's been working with parents and carers for over 20 years on all aspects of children's behaviour and well-being across a variety of ages. She has a postgraduate qualification in developmental psychology and a talent for helping parents and carers step back and reflect on parenting child dynamics and implementing small changes that make a big difference. And I can say from experience from her previous webinars, Anita speaks honestly and openly, but I would say she stands by us as parents and carers, and there's no judgment or any form of kind of patronising that maybe over the years when I've worked with different speakers, they try to offer. I feel like she's living and breathing in our shoes daily. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Anita, and thank you so much for joining us again.
Oh, thank you. It's brilliant to be back. This is a bit of a tricky topic, as many parenting topics are, but I want to make it really clear it's perfectly normal to worry about our children. Worrying about our children just comes with the territory of loving them and caring for them. However, having said that, too much worrying isn't really helpful, and it's not helpful for us as adults. It's not good for our well-being, but it's also not very good for our children, because when we worry we tend to avoid, and we tend to be quite risk averse, and that can, if we kind of follow through too much with that, negatively impact children's resilience. So today is about acknowledging it's fine to worry about our kids. That's part of our job. It's our job to safeguard them. But equally, we need to be a little bit mindful about worrying about them too much, and how possibly can we go about kind of, changing that if we are worrying a little bit too much. I don't need to introduce myself. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. There is a QR code there. You're welcome to use that to find out more about me, to connect with me on social media, to navigate to my website, to my blog. I write a parenting advice blog which is called Thinking Parenting. And on there, you will find lots and lots of resources on this topic and every other topic. So do head there and have a look. And I know we have some resources as well that we will circulate. But if you're watching this on catch up, you can just use the QR code to get to where you need to get to. Brilliant. Let's get going. What are we going to talk about this evening? So the agenda today is really about what are the kind of very common traps that we fall into as parents when it comes to worrying. Very natural, very normal, but we can get a bit stuck in those traps, and that's why I call them traps. We'll think about what the impacts of our worrying when it gets a little bit excessive, what those impacts might be on our children. And if we're going to think about, well, what do I do about that? I think it's quite helpful to understand what anxiety is. So I'll just kind of like unpick a little bit what anxiety is, how it operates, and therefore what might help. Ways that we might be able to kind of use our nervous system to calm ourselves, ways that we might be able to use our thought processes to talk ourselves down when we're worrying, ways that we might just be able to offload and park those worries and just put them down for a minute for a little bit of relief, and how we can take some brave steps when we're feeling a bit concerned. Maybe we are worried about giving more freedom to our children, but we know that that's one of the things they need. How can we go about doing that in a manageable way? I will talk a little bit at the end, just point you to some places where you can get help, whether that's for your own worrying or if your child is also a bit of a worrier as well. But that's the plan that I'm gonna talk through. So these common worry traps. I'll confess, I have fallen into all of these traps at one stage or another. As I said, we are responsible for our children. They're not yet capable of understanding risks fully or looking after themselves. They can't always predict the consequences of their actions, or they're not very good at that. So we do have to do the thinking for our children. But worrying about our children becomes a problem when it's the kind of the main way our mind operates. So when it starts to dictate our actions, or when it starts to undermine our well-being or impact on our children's development and well-being, because maybe we stop them doing things that would actually be good for them. So the common traps that we fall into, and you may have one favorite of all of these. You may have sampled all of these worry traps, as I have myself. If you do, have a think as I go through whether or not you recognize these, either in yourself or in your partner, co-parent, or anybody else. The first trap is overgeneralizing. Now, overgeneralizing involves making general, usually negative conclusions based on just one example or one incident. So, for example, your child comes home from school and they tell you about little bit of an altercation that they had with one of their friends, and you start to worry that maybe they are kind of don't have any friends, they're socially isolated, maybe they're being bullied. We start to globalize a whole negative conclusion based on actually what was just one incident, one thing that happened. Now, catastrophizing is very similar. Except that with catastrophizing, we tend to worry kind of all the way into the future. So, for example, if you have a young child, a 4 or 5-year-old, and maybe they're struggling to kind of manage their anger, not uncommon at that age, and they are lashing out, maybe, causing problems in their friendship groups, or indeed lashing out, to you. And we start to worry. Oh no, my child's going to be labeled the naughty kid. And, at school, they are going to be the one who's naughty. They're going to get into trouble. They're going to be kind of constantly removed from the classroom or for fighting. They're going to end up getting excluded from school, and then antisocial behavior. And that's it. Their whole life is just going to be dominated by not being able to control their anger. So we get on a train of worry way, way into the future, and we bring the whole weight of that projected, imagined future onto the present moment and worrying about our child, when actually we've just got a 4 or 5-year-old who's still trying to learn how to manage their emotions. So we worry into the future when we catastrophize. All or nothing thinking, another one of my favorites. That's when we focus on the extremes. And it kind of ignore the more likely middle ground. So, for example, we might have an argument with our child, or maybe they push back at a boundary, or we perhaps snap at them because we're not feeling that patient, we're tired from work, and they don't want to go to bed. And then in the evening, later, once they've gone to bed, we kind of spend the rest of the time worrying that we're a really bad parent because of that kind of interaction that we had with them, when probably if we were more realistic, we probably had some good bits to the evening and some bad bits, and we're probably doing more than a good enough job overall. So we tend to focus on the extremes with all or nothing. Worst case scenario scanning, very common in parents. That typically happens when our child is faced with a risk. So for example, let's imagine they are walking along the top of a wall, or maybe they're on a piece of equipment in the playground and we worry about them falling off. We might even visualize that happening, visualize things like injuries. Our brain can really kind of get quite graphic and think about that, and we start planning, what would I do if that happened? Maybe our teenager has gone to the park with their friends, and we start imagining terrible things that might happen to them. So we really start dwelling on those worst case scenarios, which are probably quite unlikely. Mind reading, that's when you assume that you know what someone else is thinking, just what it sounds like, or we guess what they're thinking based on, without really asking them. So that could be just worrying that your mother is judging your parenting, because of one thing that she says. Actually, maybe she's just concerned about you, concerned about your well-being, and wants to help, but we kind of assume what her thoughts are, and often we assume the negatives in their thoughts, or we worry that our child is upset or hurt by an interaction. Maybe they go up to some other children and they ask to play with them, and the children say no and they come away, and we project and think, oh, they must be very upset by that, when actually we don't know. We haven't asked our child. Maybe they're not that bothered about it. Maybe they are upset, but we're mind reading. We're not actually asking. Now, fear of children's distress, the last bullet there, it's not so much a worry trap as a discomfort with our children experiencing difficult thoughts or feelings. It can lead us to be averse to our children kind of experiencing anything negative, anything uncomfortable. And that's a bit problematic, because our children are bound to experience negative situations and negative feelings. And it's actually important that they do, because they need to learn to cope with life's ups and downs. And we can't keep everything smooth for them. We can't wrap them up in cotton wool. So, yeah, when we kind of have a fear or a real discomfort when our children are upset, it often leads us to kind of worry about those situations or try and avoid them. Now, those of you who've got teenagers, or, even 11, 12-year-olds, I think worrying can be particularly acute at that time in children's lives. I don't think, to be honest, that I slept properly for about 5 years from worrying about my teenagers. I had one who was particularly prone to taking risks, and because the risks become greater, the stakes are higher with teenagers. They've got all those really important exams, and it feels like if they're going to get into trouble, it's going to be big trouble, not kind of little trouble, the stuff that might impact the whole of the rest of their lives. Yet at the same time, we've got all these big risks, these big stakes. At the same time, they're demanding independence from us. And some of them are really sensible, and they use that independence really wisely. Some of them do really stupid things, and they make bad decisions, and that's part of, being a teenager, and that's part of learning. And they can be very risk taking or anti-authority, for example. And it's hard, I think, for us as parents to manage that when we have to hand over a bit of power and independence, because otherwise they will just take it, but they might not handle it well. So it can be a particularly difficult time in terms of worrying, when we've got teenagers. So just a bit of empathy, really, for those of you that have. Now, I don't know if you recognize any of those in yourself, if you thought, oh, yeah, 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 and you ticked them all off the list, or whether there was just one and you thought, oh, yeah, that's my favorite. But it's worth kind of reflecting and thinking about that. What are your mental habits when it comes to worrying? Because noticing them and spotting them, that's the first part of being able to do something a bit differently. If you don't see yourself doing it, it's much harder to kind of change your patterns. So have a think about that. Which ones are the ones that you particularly are prone to doing? I mean, as I said, it is totally natural to worry about our kids. Worrying is a sign that we care, and that we're engaged in supporting our children. But it becomes a problem when anxiety leads us to overestimate the impact of individual decisions or events, so that we become stuck in our worries. Or when it impacts our behaviour and we start avoiding situations that might be particularly important for our children's development. Particularly, I think worrying can lead us to avoid risks because we want to keep children safe. And it feels like, keeping children safe is page one of, being an adult who's caring for a child. And of course, to some extent, that's totally valid. Of course it is. But although we shouldn't be allowing our toddler to cross the road by themselves, at some point, our child will need to learn to cross the road, or to go to the shops by themselves, or to use public transport. They can't learn to do that without practice and without experience. So we can't hold them back from learning to do things developmentally that they need to be learning. And I think it's important to note, when we look at the research on safeguarding and on keeping children safe, one of the most crucial factors in whether or not children are safe is not necessarily always the adults around them, it's children's own knowledge, knowing how to keep themselves safe. So rather than simply protecting children and kind of like keeping them safe, we actually need to develop their skills to keep themselves safe. So that involves them experiencing a little bit of risk, being exposed to risk in an age-appropriate way, in an appropriate manner. But we have to allow them to do that in order to grow. And not only is that good for them in terms of them keeping themselves safe, but being challenged, being a little bit outside your comfort zone as a child is really important to their development. When they face challenges and they learn through those challenges, maybe they make mistakes, maybe they get things wrong, maybe something uncomfortable happens. But when they face challenges and they learn through them, that really builds children's self-esteem and they feel good about themselves. Risk and challenge is important for building self-esteem. It's not something we can avoid completely and build children's self-esteem, because in order to feel good about themselves, children need lots of, I call them moments to shine. A moment to shine is that moment when a child feels proud of themselves, like they have risen to a challenge, they've done something difficult, they feel like they've achieved something. Maybe it was something they couldn't do last time they tried. It doesn't have to be an extraordinary achievement. It doesn't have to be, them excelling in music or art or drama or sport. A moment to shine can come just when children learn a new life skill. For a young child, it might be learning to do a button up on their trousers, or succeeding in something for the first time. For an older child, it might be learning to cook their first meal for themselves. And sometimes those kind of moments to shine, where they rise to a challenge, they do involve taking a little bit of a risk, a healthy risk in play. And that's important, that we don't always step in and kind of stop children doing that. We want them to be at the edge of their competence in a safe context, but in a way where they're stretching themselves. It's like that moment. You remember when you had a toddler, when they were little, and they wanted to climb the slide on the ladder, but they weren't very good at climbing a ladder. But you have to let them practice. You can't just keep picking them up and putting them at the top. So what you do is you stand there and you kind of hover, but you let go, just ready to catch maybe in case. And then as they get better at it, you step back a little bit further and you let them get on with it. And yet, when they're a little bit bigger and they forget about how to climb a slide safely, and maybe they rush, maybe they do fall off, but they're learning, how do I extend my skills? And not only that, every time we step back, children get that feeling of, I've got this. I can do this. I'm believed in. We show that we believe in our children by allowing them to take that challenge and think, yeah, I think you can do this. When we step in, we're basically saying, no, I don't think you're capable of that. You need me to manage that for you. And that doesn't give them those opportunities. Children are constantly learning from us, of course, and our thought patterns and our actions are things that children read. We know that anxiety runs in families. If you're a bit of a worrier, there's a chance that your child will be a bit of a worrier. Some of that is genetic. It's nothing that you can help. Some of us have temperaments that are more predisposed to worrying. Some of it is learned behavior. It's behavior that we maybe learned from our experiences, or that our children equally can learn from us. And that is a bit of a problem, because when children are anxious, they often avoid things. They avoid new situations, new people, new challenges. And what we want for children is to have as wide a variety of experiences in their life as possible, because that's how they build their brains, their skills, those experiences get plugged into what they know. And equally, the same is true for emotional resilience. We want our children to have a range of emotions in order to be able to recognize and manage those. So trying to kind of smooth everything so our children never feel hurt, never feel disappointed, never feel frustrated, and kind of protecting them too much, it impacts negatively on their ability to cope with life and with themselves and the things that will inevitably happen to them. So it's really important that we learn to manage our own worries as parents, so that we can help our children really get the most out of their experiences and out of their development. I said I'd sort of just talk really briefly about what anxiety is, because I think this is really helpful. I find this useful. And anxiety is perfectly normal, whether you call it anxiety or worrying. Basically, it's our brain telling us, oh, there's something you need to look out for here. There's some danger. It's our little alarm system that goes off, and it alerts us. But sometimes we can have a slightly hyperactive kind of alarm system, and maybe it can start going off in a way that is not in proportion to the actual threat that might be there. And we start to feel anxious regardless of how likely or how it is to happen, or how bad that thing might be. And when we get that kind of anxiety response, it all comes as a rush. We just kind of feel it all at once. But when we break it down, there's actually 3 components to anxiety. We've got the cognitive, the mental part of it, which is the types of thoughts we have in our head. So when we're feeling anxious, when we're worrying, so a parent might think, they might have words in their head saying, no one will like my child and they will be unhappy. Or you might have a worry thought such as, people will think I'm a bad parent. And they can be quite intrusive, these thoughts, and they're not in proportion to the actual situation. But those are the words in our head. The physical side of anxiety is what we feel in our bodies when we're anxious or worried. So maybe our heart might beat faster, we might feel nauseous, there's that really kind of feeling in your tummy, or we might start to sweat or frown. So it's like the physical sort of symptoms that we get. And then the behavior side of anxiety is what we do when we feel anxious. So a worried parent, when you're worried, you might snap at your child or be a little bit impatient. You might go and search your teenager's room because you're worried about them. The most common thing we do when we're anxious is we avoid something. We try to get out of the situation that's making us worried, or try not to go into it. So we might, for example, avoid going to a supermarket with our child because we're worried that our child will have a meltdown and everyone will stare at us. So we just think, well, I just won't go. So sometimes worrying leads us to avoidance. But it's important to understand that there are actually 3 separate components to anxiety, because that gives us 3 separate ways also to try and manage it, to try and kind of stand down those responses. There's not a single cause of anxiety. It's really usually quite a combination of factors that make us a bit of a worrier or make us anxious. Some of us, as I said, it might be just genetic. It's our temperamental predisposition. We might have a slightly more reactive nervous system. Or, those of us who've got anxious temperaments might be prone to perfectionism. That, predisposes lots of people to higher levels of anxiety, where we really want to get everything right. Or there might be a triggering event. Something might have happened. Your child having an illness, a really serious illness, having a really difficult birth experience, experience at a time when your child got lost or something happened to them. And if you're not neatly neurotypical, people who are neurodivergent often are a little bit more prone to anxiety, for example. So there are lots of reasons why, we might be more anxious or more of a worrier than other people. I think, what do we do about that? I think is the question, isn't it? If we're going to manage our parental worries, I think that starts with learning to be comfortable with and learning to accept some quite difficult ideas. And, one of those is that constantly worrying and being afraid of things, or afraid that things might not go well, doesn't make things go right. It doesn't influence what happens. That worrying doesn't make something more or less likely to happen. Everything in a child's life involves a risk. If we focus too much on that, it's quite disabling. We love our children so much. If we think too much about the difficult things that can happen, or the potential, sort of downsides of everything, then for us, it's hard to connect with our kids because we've got all those thoughts going on, but it's also hard for us to allow them to do the learning that they need to do. So one of the things I'd invite you to think about is the fact that you're probably not as important as you think you are in your child's life. Sometimes we avoid things or we worry about things because we are worried about what other people will think of us. We judge ourselves as parents very harshly, and that, we think we're a bad parent when actually we've just made one very small and inevitable mistake. But we're quite worried about being judged as a bad parent because we think that everything we do is going to have a huge impact on our children. And that just isn't the truth. That, yes, we influence our children, but it's very seldom that one small decision is going to be the defining moment in a child's life. Maybe think back to when your child was a baby. Think about a decision that you really worried over, and it might have been whether or not to allow them to have a pacifier, or whether or not to use sleep training, or whether or not to use baby-led weaning, or decisions that felt incredibly important at that time, when we move forward and we look backwards, we realize they weren't so important. So things are not as important often as we think they are. But we have to look underneath that and think, why am I worrying about that? And that actually discomfort and fear and worrying are part of the territory of being a parent. We can't manage all risk out of existence. We can't optimize our children, into some perfect person, that there will be messiness and bumps and tears and problems. And that is part of the joy and the challenge of being a parent. And we need to have a level of acceptance if we're going to make rational choices. We have to know that these are the people I love the most in my life, and yet I am not completely in control of what's going to happen to them, and that's uncomfortable. But if I can go with that, we can probably make good decisions and enjoy ourselves. So, yeah, it can be helpful, I think, to unpick some of the beliefs maybe that lead us there. There's a quote here. I've put a quote on the screen. It's from a book called The Gift of Failure. It's a lovely book by Jessica Leahy about why we should let our children fail and why we don't let them fail as parents, or why we don't let them take risks. And sometimes I think what, for me, this quote really sums up is sometimes we don't let our children take risks or do things or take on challenges that would be good for them because of our discomfort, not because of necessarily a rational reason that somehow we feel like that's one more day of them being safe. Today they got to school safely, maybe tomorrow they'll do their own homework, but today they got a good grade because I helped them and they avoided the disappointment of getting it wrong. So, I don't know, maybe that strikes a chord with you, that quote. Maybe you recognize yourself in that, even in some small way, that really sometimes we're serving our own needs and our own comfort by kind of following through on our worries and perhaps not allowing our children as much kind of freedom, as much room to roam, room to explore, room to make mistakes as might be good for them. So I'd invite you to take that away and kind of, reflect on it and see whether it is something that that resonates with you. If you are a bit of a worrier, though, one thing I really want you to go away with are some concrete ideas about how to kind of go about perhaps standing down some of those worries. And lots of the strategies I'm going to talk about are really adapted from CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And they build on the idea that there are these three components of anxiety: the mind, the body, and the actions, the behavior. So one of the, important parts of anxiety is our bodies. It's physiological. It's how we feel. And therefore, a really useful way of countering anxiety is by using our bodies. That's why things like breathing strategies are really helpful for standing down our nervous system. Things that relax our bodies and that really hack the nervous system. There are lots of different types of breathing. I've kind of named a few here: finger breathing, box breathing, feather breathing. These are all basically different ways of visualizing in order to breathe deeply. Some of these you can do with your children. I'm a real fan of using finger breathing with small children. Some people call this starfish breathing. It's basically when you hold out your hand or they hold out their hand and draw around it with the other, with your other hand, slowly breathing as you go. So starting at the base of the thumb, breathing in on the way up, pause, out on the way down, in on the way up, pause, out on the way down. Now, all we're really doing there is taking 5 deep breaths, but it's a nice anchor for doing that. It's a lovely one to do with your children as a kind of calming thing for them. So think about how you might be able to use breath to be able to calm yourself. You can also use kind of mindfulness strategies like meditation. So I'm a really big fan of the Headspace app, which is kind of those guided meditations that basically help you breathe and relax your body. And I can do like 5-minute ones of those and really feel a big difference. Some people find actually exercise is a way to hack their nervous system. Because if you think about it, my son used to love jumping up and down on the trampoline when he was feeling worried. And it's just a way of controlling your breathing and regularizing it. So going for a run, if I'm worried about something, tends to make me feel a lot better. So, or it could be something, a bit calming like yoga. The other thing, this is a bit controversial, I love a bit of cold water immersion. That might be your idea of hell, but there is some evidence that when we learn to dip in cold water or expose ourselves to cold water, we are learning to manage our panic reactions, manage our kind of nervous system. We're developing practice about how to calm ourselves, and that can be then transferable into kind of anxious situations or worried situations. Some people just prefer going for a walk, and doing kind of forest bathing, feeling like you're outdoors, getting all of that relaxation from nature. So think about, what can I do physically that just helps me de-stress, de-worry, calms my body down, and maybe stands down some of those kind of worried feelings. You can, of course, also use your mind. So that mental part of anxiety is often the words we have in our head. So one of the things we can do is change the words in our head. So if we notice that we're feeling worried and we notice that we've got worried words, we could try and replace them with other ones. And we might have a set phrase that we use. Something like, yep, I'm worried, but worried isn't going to help, so I might as well let it go. Or it could be something motivational, something that works for you. You can write that down on a card. It's like, I've been here before, nothing bad happened. I've been worried before, and it was all okay. A kind of statement that helps you change perhaps the thoughts in your head and calms you down a little. If you think, the mental side of worrying is something you'd like to work on, you can practice that way of thinking, that way of kind of, we call it mental gym, really, of practicing more flexible thinking. And there's a little routine that you can go through to do this. And the first one, if you find yourself really worrying about something, my child has had an argument with their best friend at school. Okay, so what do you start worrying about? Maybe what you've got in your head is, they don't have a best friend, they're going to be lonely, they're very upset, or this person is being unkind to them. I'm worried that they're not enjoying school. Any of the worried thoughts and words that you might have in your head, identify them, but also maybe have a look at some of the beliefs underneath that, because we do have a tendency to think that thoughts are facts. Another example might be your child fails a test at school. Maybe they fail a maths test, and you worry about that. You think, oh, they're struggling academically. This is not great. They're not managing to keep up to the expected standard. And then we start doing that catastrophic thinking, and my child's going to end up working in McDonald's in some crummy low paid job. We kind of jump onto that train, all because they didn't do well in that one maths test, and they're finding it hard at the moment. And what we try and do here is kind of just notice what happens. I've got these thoughts in my head. What's going on in my body? Well, my heart's racing. I'm feeling really tense. I feel that kind of slightly panicky feeling. And then what are we doing? What do we do as a result of that? What are the beliefs underneath this? So the belief might be that, well, if my child doesn't get into college, then I failed as a parent, or that means they're not as good as another child who does get into college. Or be honest with yourself, face some of the thoughts and beliefs that you might have, and then think about, what do I do as a result of that? When I panic about my child's maths, do I do anything helpful? What are the things I do? Do I run into their room and start having a go at them, telling them they need to study harder? And when you've kind of done that analysis of where you're at, then we practice doing something different. We go back to the facts. What are the facts? The facts are my child has failed one maths test and they're finding this term of maths hard. Okay, so what other thoughts might somebody else have about that? You know, what alternative thoughts and beliefs might somebody else have? I find it hard to think about, I find it easier rather to think about a character. Like, what would my sister, she's quite brave and sensible, what would she be thinking in this situation? She'd probably be thinking, well, it's not their fault. They're struggling with this. Maybe they need a little bit more help, or maybe they don't like that particular topic, or maybe they're just not clicking with that teacher at this moment. So she'd be much more sensible. So I try and channel another person and think, how would they think? And how, if I could channel those thoughts, how would I feel? Would I feel differently? Would I feel calmly? Would I do something different? Would I maybe think, okay, so perhaps what I really need to do here is just set aside a little bit of time to investigate what's going on, or to put a little bit of support in place and come up with a more helpful response. So when we kind of go through this routine, starting with, what's going on, what am I thinking, how am I feeling, what am I doing, what are my beliefs, and then we go back to the beginning. So, okay, what were the facts again? What other thoughts might I have? What other beliefs are possible? If I had those, how would I feel? And what actions might that lead me to? And if we practice doing that again and again, we can sometimes liberate ourselves a bit from those recurrent thoughts and feelings, and use our minds to kind of step into a slightly different way of doing things. We can also just think about parking our worries. Sometimes we can't work through them. We just have to dump them. And we might have a worry book where we write things down and say, right, what am I worried about? I'm worried about this. Write it down. It's in the book. I don't need to think about it. Or a worry time. Worry time is a bit counterintuitive, but it does work. It's when you set aside a time in the day, might be just 15 minutes. We say, I'm going to do all my worrying in that 15 minutes. In that 15 minutes, I'm going to sit there. I'm going to worry. And then when the alarm goes off on my phone and 15 minutes is finished, I'm going to stop my worrying. And if any worry thoughts pop into my head in the meantime, I'm going to make a note, a voice note, a mental note. Okay, I'll worry about that next time I'm doing worry time. It might be something that we do once a day. Some people find that really helpful. Some people find it helpful to talk it through with somebody and kind of park their fears a little bit. Not because we think somebody else has the solution, just by talking it through, we can offload a little bit. You might find those helpful strategies. The other thing we can change, so we thought about how do we work with our body to stand down our worries? How do I work with our brains to stand down our worries? We can also work with our actions, doing something different in order to change our worries. And I think this is particularly helpful, when we need to expand our comfort zone a little bit, because the brain learns through experience. Avoiding a situation that makes us a bit worried makes us more worried. If we won't let our child climb on that climbing frame because we're too worried they'll fall, that increases our anxiety. It doesn't decrease it. If we want to decrease the anxiety, we need to take some small, brave steps. So we might say, it's okay, get onto the bottom rung. Yeah, let's get onto the bottom rung and we can dance around and we can see how I feel about that. And I can get used to you being that far off the ground. So it's the idea of we call it gradual exposure, but it's the idea of a ladder that helps you overcome your fears. So the one on the screen there is actually for a teenager, a slightly older teenager who's worried about staying by themselves. They've got that kind of separation anxiety. They don't want to be on their own. That's quite an extreme case. And we can kind of think, well, what little steps might they be able to take? They might just be able to stay upstairs in the house by themselves without an adult, so the adult's downstairs, and just do that for 15 minutes. So when we gradually take a small step, we feel worried, but it's manageable worry, and we get used to being able to do that. And then we take another braver step. and we gradually kind of desensitize ourselves to those worries. And that's particularly helpful if you are introducing your child to new freedoms. And that is something we need to do, and particularly as they get older and they kind of move into those secondary and teenage years, we have to start handing over a little bit of freedom. So we need to do that in those small, bite-sized, manageable pieces. And that means maybe brainstorming with our child. Maybe you've got a younger teenager who wants to go to the shopping centre by themselves or with friends for the day without you or without an adult. Actually saying to them, okay, this is what worries me. This is what I'm a bit worried might happen. I'm worried that there might be some creepy people or some older teenagers, or I'm worried one of your friends will do something silly, or I'm worried you'll lose your phone and you won't be able to get in touch with me. Go through all the things that you're worried about using what ifs and their worries too. It might be what they're worried about, which could be totally different from the things you're worried about. And then make a plan. Say, okay, what could we do to kind of mitigate some of those risks? So having a plan that if everybody loses their phones, what would you do? So if there were some, other kids who were being annoying, what would you do? You talk about, where are safe places to be? What would be your processes? And then you think, okay, so that's a bit much to go for a whole day. What would be a baby step on the way? So maybe rather than you all getting the bus into town for the whole day and coming back again, I'll drive you the first time and I'll be in the shopping centre, but not with you. We'll do that for an hour and then we'll meet up. So you do something small and you see how they did. Are they ready for this? We're not kind of handing over all of the freedom all at once. We're testing the ground. How sensible are they? How able to manage this are they? And we're putting the kind of safeguards in place around what they're doing, and taking those small steps, we can not only build our child's skills and their confidence, we can build our ability to feel like it's okay to have our children out of our sight and to allow them to do those things. And we give them the freedom in those little bite-sized chunks. And if it all goes a little bit wrong in that small bite size, then we say, okay, I think you're not ready for that yet. We'll try again later. But we grow our confidence by taking small steps. So if there's something you're worried about with your child, if there's something you've been thinking about while I was talking, think about what would be the smallest little step towards that I might be able to take, that I'd be happy to have a go at, and see if you can identify that to help your child kind of build their skills and to help you kind of get used to being in that situation or them being in that situation. I'm going to finish very soon. I just wanted to point you in the direction of some resources that might be helpful if you feel like, if anxiety is an issue in your family. The time to seek help, and that's the most common question I'm asked, is really when anxiety is getting in the way of normal childhood experiences. Now, that could be your anxiety. Maybe I will not let my child go on a school trip because I'm too worried about them. That might be a sign that you need to get some help and support because that's interfering with their normal developmental experiences. It could be your child is too worried to go, in which case they might need some help. The first place always is your family doctor. They may be able to refer you to cognitive behavioural therapy. There's lots of online options for doing that. School, obviously, talk to school. They may well be able to refer you to support, especially it's for your child. There is a parenting course. If your child is a worrier, you may well be as well. But for children with anxiety, there is a specialised Triple P Fearless course, which I think is for ages 6 to 14. That's an online course. We offer that as part of a package with some sort of one-to-one support via Zoom, or you can do it as a standalone course. That's a really good course for thinking about how do I parent, especially if I'm a worrier, how do I parent in a way that helps my child become less anxious, if that's something that's going on in your family? Obviously, the NHS, the Every Mind Matters website is really helpful. There's a lovely Australian psychotherapist called Karen Young, who has a website called Hey Sigmund, which you might want to have a look at, which is really interesting articles on there about anxiety as well, and particularly for children, but also for parents as well. So those might be places you can get help. I will leave you with a QR code so that you can head to my website, have a look at some of the resources on there. There's on my blog on Thinking Parenting, there is a post which is, where to get help for my child's mental health or for my family's mental health. That's got lots and lots of resources in it. And there's also a section on mental health where you can have a look at, particularly things that might help family mental health, and lots of other articles as well. I really hope you found that helpful, and that everybody's taking away some ideas and maybe some inspiration to challenge yourself a little bit in one particular place to perhaps face some of those worries, or find a way to stand those down, and with a better understanding of how worries might be impacting on your child, and why it's important as parents that, yes, we're bound to worry. We should worry about our children, but we also equally need to stop that kind of tipping over to being too much. I wish you all good luck with that. Thank you all.